The photocopy of my settlement breakdown resting on my mother's oak coffee table had my name printed at the top. Across the bottom margin, Paige had already written the routing number for Velomotion's business account in blue ink. The paper felt thick and stiff under my fingertips, and as I traced the indented numbers, a familiar, cold knot formed in my stomach. At 38 years old, after spending a decade working as an independent operations and compliance specialist, I knew how to read documents. People always left their true intentions in the margins. The sharp clack of Paige pacing across the vintage Persian rug echoed in the quiet living room. The heavy, sweet scent of her jasmine perfume completely masked the smell of the herbal tea I had brewed, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. "You are alive, Lauren," Paige said. She stopped pacing and pointed a manicured finger at the settlement letter. "You survived, so you do not need all $750,000. My jaw tightened. A sharp line of nerve pain shot down my right leg, a burning sensation that started at my hip and throbbed all the way to my ankle. I shifted my weight, leaning heavily on the aluminum cane pressed against the arm of my floral chair. The rubber tips squeaked against the hardwood floor underneath the edge of the rug. "I need capital for my brand," my sister continued, completely ignoring my obvious discomfort. "The retail deal for Velomotion is closing next month, and we are short on the bridge funding." My mother sat on the sofa opposite me, calmly stirring honey into her chamomile tea. The silver spoon clinked rhythmically against the delicate porcelain. "It really is a lucky break, Lauren," Judith said gently. "This money could save the company." "Are you asking for a gift, a loan, or an investment?" I asked. My voice came out perfectly level, betraying none of the fire burning behind my ribs. Paige rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her silk blouse. "Family does not charge family interest. You know I am good for it." "You always helped Paige with the operations before," my mother added. She took a slow, elegant sip of her tea. "This is just another way to support her. We have worked so hard to build this brand, and it would be a terrible shame to lose it now just because you are holding on to a payout." I watched my mother closely. The woman who had raised me always used the word "we" when talking about the financial success of the brand, but she exclusively used the word "you" when referring to the agonizing months I spent in the hospital. The hypocrisy tasted like ash in my mouth. A sudden memory flashed in my mind. The damp, metallic smell of the fulfillment center, Paige standing in the middle of Bay 4, waving away my concerns, telling me I worried too much about safety protocols and deadlines. And then came the deafening crash of the steel storage racks coming down. I pushed the memory away and focused on the paper sitting in front of me. "If you want the money, I need a formal request in writing. I need to know exactly how much you are asking for, what the funds will be used for, and the precise timeline for repayment." Paige let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh. "Why do you always have to be so rigid? You act like I am some stranger trying to scam you. I am your sister." I did not argue with her. I knew better than to debate accountability with someone who saw boundaries as personal insults. Instead, I reached into the leather tote bag resting at my feet and pulled out a different document. It was a 20-page contract, thick and professionally bound, with 3 bright red sticky tabs protruding from the right edge. I placed it gently on top of her settlement breakdown. "This is a conditional capital subscription and corporate records authorization," I said. Paige stared at the thick stack of paper like it was a foreign object. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means there will be no money transferred before a full records review is completed," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "I need to see the internal logs, the safety tickets, and the maintenance history from the week of the accident. I highly recommend you take this to your corporate lawyer and let them read it before you sign anything." My mother set her teacup down with a sharp clatter, spilling a few amber drops onto the saucer. "Lauren, bringing lawyers into this will only delay the retail deal. Paige does not have time for a drawn-out review." "How fast does the money transfer after I sign?" Paige asked. She was already reaching into her designer handbag for a pen, completely ignoring my warning. "If the records are clean," I said, keeping my eyes locked on hers, "the process can move quickly." Paige did not bother reading the summary page. She flipped straight to the back, her gold bracelets jingling against the glass table as she searched for the red tabs. My sister signed her name with aggressive looping strokes, pressing so hard the ink nearly tore through the heavy legal stock. When she finished, the young executive slid the document back across the table with a triumphant, self-satisfied smile. "There," Paige said. "Now you can stop playing auditor and actually help the family." Judith beamed at her youngest daughter, then looked over at me with an approving nod. "You see, Lauren? I knew you would eventually learn to put your family before yourself." I did not smile back. I picked up my phone, opened the camera app, and took a clear photograph of the signature page. I opened my messages and sent the high-resolution image directly to Naomi, my civil attorney, right there at the table. "When will the money be in my account?" Paige demanded. She was already checking her phone for incoming emails. "The review begins tomorrow morning," I replied. I braced both hands on the armrests and stood up slowly. The nerve damage flared, hot and sharp, but I refused to wince. Judith reached out to help me, and I pulled my arm away before she could make contact. I walked toward the front door, focusing entirely on keeping my steps even and steady. "Do not change your mind on me, Lauren," Paige called out from the living room. I stepped out into the cool evening air and walked down the brick driveway to my set-in. Once inside, I locked the doors and pulled out my phone. I checked my sent folder. The legal preservation notices I had drafted with Naomi were all perfectly queued up and ready to go. They still had full legal effect. My phone buzzed against my palm. It was Naomi. "I got the photo," my lawyer said, her voice crisp and professional through the car speaker. "The authorization is perfectly clear. She signed it in her official capacity as Chief Executive Officer of Vela Motion. Are you absolutely sure you want to pull the trigger on this? Once these document requests hit the vendors and the insurance company, your family will know you are investigating them." "Send them," I said. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. Then I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a plain manila folder. I opened it under the dim, yellow glow of the dome light. Inside was a photocopy of a temporary operations acknowledgement from the official insurance file. It was a document I had never seen before my injury, dated exactly 2 days after the racks collapsed in Bay 4. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my name, perfectly spelled. But the slant of the letter L was a millimeter too sharp. Someone had forged my signature while I was lying in a hospital bed, bleeding and unconscious. I did not need my sister to be grateful. The money was never the first thing I wanted from her. I just needed to know exactly whose hand had signed my life away. 6 months before the accident, the Hartwell Fulfillment Center smelled like industrial cardboard and burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, constant note that gave me a headache by mid-afternoon. I stood at a packing station, manually overriding a routing error that threatened to delay 200 Vela Motion orders. My sister was busy doing a live broadcast on her social media, claiming full credit for the seamless logistics of her athleisure brand. Meanwhile, I was the one untangling the actual supply chain. When the final shipping label printed, I did not just walk away. I opened the master spreadsheet on my tablet and logged my 3 hours of crisis management. In the past, I would have deleted that entry to save the company money, but something had shifted in me. I opened a separate banking app and transferred a portion of my independent consulting fees into a brand new savings account. That same afternoon, I scheduled a viewing for a small condominium across town. It had an elevator, secure parking, and 0 room for uninvited family members. Later that week, I sat at my kitchen table with a 20-page contract from a new corporate client. The paper was crisp and the terms were strictly standard, but I still read every single line. I always read before I signed. My pen scratched against the signature line, leaving a clear, dark impression of my name. I scanned the document, saved the original in my locked filing cabinet, and emailed a copy to the client. My mother stopped by just as I closed my laptop. Judith took one look at the real estate brochures spread across my counter and clicked her tongue. "You really should not be separating your money from the family right now," Judith said. She picked up a brochure and dropped it back down onto the granite counter. "Paige is expanding so fast. She needs everyone pulling in the same direction." "I am pulling my own weight," I replied, stacking the brochures into a neat pile. "And I am stepping down from my unofficial operations role at Vela in exactly 6 months. Judith pressed her lips together. The woman who had spent decades managing family optics looked at me with deep disappointment. You are abandoning your sister right when she is about to make us all proud. I did not argue. I just kept packing my briefcase. 3 days before the accident, the tension in the warehouse finally snapped. I met Owen Park near the loading docks. The senior technician from Northline Industrial wiped grease from his hands with a red rag and pointed toward the massive storage structure designated as Bay 4. The safety interlock on the automated lift is completely stripped, Owen said, his voice echoing over the roar of the conveyor belts. If that mechanism slips while the line is moving, the whole rack comes down. You need to remove Bay 4 from service immediately. Marcus Reed, the shift supervisor, shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. He wiped sweat from his forehead. If we shut down Bay 4, we bottleneck the entire spring launch shipment. Paige is going to kill me. A delayed shipment can be expedited, I told Marcus, keeping my tone steady. A crushed spine cannot be fixed. Shut it down. Owen nodded, pulled out his rugged tablet, and generated the official maintenance ticket. He printed a hard copy and handed it to me. The heavy black letters at the top clearly stated that the equipment was unsafe for operation. I walked straight to my car, opened my laptop, and drafted an email to Paige, Judith, Marcus, and the facility management team. I attached a photo of the printed ticket and clearly stated that Bay 4 must remain closed until the interlock was replaced. My phone rang less than 2 minutes later. "Are you actively trying to ruin this company?" Paige shouted through the speaker. "The retail buyers are watching our fulfillment metrics this week. You cannot just halt the main line over a technicality." "It is not a technicality, Paige," I said, watching the warehouse doors through my windshield. "The equipment is compromised. Someone is going to get hurt. You always see disasters where there are only minor inconveniences," my sister snapped. "I cannot miss the launch shipment." She hung up on me. 10 minutes later, a company-wide email arrived in my inbox from the chief executive officer. Paige had replied to my warning thread with a direct order. The message was brief and reckless. It read, "We cannot miss the launch shipment. Keep the line moving until Friday." I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I decided right then that 6 months was too long. I was leaving the company the second the spring launch shipped. That promise barely lasted 48 hours. On the morning of the accident, Paige called me in a panic, claiming there was a critical routing failure on the dock. She begged me to go to Hartwell and fix it. Against my better judgment, I drove to the facility. When I walked onto the warehouse floor, the first thing I noticed was the noise. The conveyor belts in Bay 4 were running at full speed. Someone had placed a piece of opaque tape over the flashing yellow warning light on the control panel. Marcus stood near the base of the racks, holding a clipboard. He looked up, saw me, and opened his mouth to speak, but a voice blared from the two-way radio clipped to his belt. It was Paige, demanding a status update on the outbound pallets. Before I could ask Marcus, who had authorized the bypass, a sharp, metallic groan echoed through the cavernous room. The sound vibrated in my chest. I looked up. A massive wooden pallet, loaded with hundreds of pounds of inventory, slid out of its designated track. The stripped interlock Owen had warned us about finally gave way with a sickening crack. "Get back!" I screamed, lunging toward Marcus. The steel support columns buckled. A shadow fell over the concrete floor, followed by the deafening roar of twisting metal and falling inventory. Something heavy slammed into my pelvis, throwing me to the ground. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, and a blinding wave of pain tore through my right leg. Dust choked the air. I lay pinned under a fractured steel beam, unable to move my lower body. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear the radio lying in the debris a few feet away. "Marcus?" Paige's voice crackled through the small speaker, sounding annoyed rather than concerned. "Marcus, answer me. Did the launch shipment get damaged?" The hospital ceiling tiles formed a dizzying grid of tiny holes. That was the first thing my eyes focused on after the surgery. Judith sat in the corner chair, calmly flipping through a glossy magazine. When she noticed my heavy eyelids fluttering open, she smoothed her skirt, walked over to the bed, and told me it was just a freak accident. Paige did not come to the hospital. My sister posted a long, tearful message on her social media feed asking for prayers, but her physical presence was notably absent. An insurance representative visited 2 days later. He held a thick clipboard, looked at my heavily bandaged leg, and asked if I had personally authorized the temporary loading procedure on the morning of the collapse. "No," I said, my throat dry from the anesthesia. "Make sure you write that down." The next 9 months dissolved into a painful blur of physical therapy and mounting medical bills. Learning to stand felt like stepping barefoot on shattered glass, and my right leg simply refused to listen to my brain most mornings. During Thanksgiving dinner, my mother put me on speakerphone so I could hear Paige tell our extended relatives that I was doing fine, quickly pointing out that at least I could still walk. Judith offered to let me move back into my childhood bedroom to save money, casually adding that Paige could drop by whenever she needed help with logistics. I declined the offer. Instead, I signed a lease on a small condominium with a reliable elevator. My independent consulting business covered the rent, and working remotely kept me entirely away from the warehouse. That was when I hired Naomi. My new civil attorney sat at my small dining table, drawing 3 distinct columns on a yellow legal pad. No, suspect, prove. I handed her printed copies of my warning email and the original safety ticket Owen had given me before the crash. Naomi immediately filed preservation notices with the vendors to lock down the data. She also looked me dead in the eye and explicitly ordered me not to use my old password to access the Vela Motion servers. Late one night, the login screen glowed brightly on my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, remembering the familiar keystrokes that could show me exactly what happened after I was crushed. Then I closed the lid. The satisfying click of the plastic casing echoed in the quiet room. Naomi brought the official claim file to my condo a few weeks later. Buried in the middle of a thick stack of paperwork was a document titled Temporary Procedure Acknowledgement. My name sat perfectly on the signature line. The loops and angles matched my handwriting flawlessly, yet I had never seen the text printed above it. The digital file was dated exactly 2 days after the accident. At that specific time, I was heavily sedated and hooked up to a morphine drip. When I mentioned the discrepancy on a phone call, Judith sighed heavily and suggested the pain medication had scrambled my memory. But my memory was perfectly clear. I always read every single line of a contract before signing my name. The warehouse operator and the equipment manufacturer eventually offered a settlement to avoid a lengthy public trial. The headline number was $750,000. My family heard that figure and immediately treated it like lottery winnings. In reality, medical liens, attorney fees, and a dedicated fund for future nerve treatments swallowed a massive portion of it. Naomi drafted a strict release form that accepted the funds but explicitly excluded Vela Motion, my sister, my mother, and any undiscovered fraud. We could prove I warned them, but we still could not prove who created the forged document or who altered the digital safety records. A subpoena would take months of fighting in court. We needed direct authorization from the company controller to access the vendor audit logs smoothly. Naomi mentioned that Paige had recently claimed absolute operational control of the fulfillment center in a pitch deck for her retail investors. My sister always wanted the credit for the brand. Her greed was a reliable engine, and I knew exactly how to use it. I looked across the table at Naomi, feeling a strange sense of clarity settle over me. Draft a corporate records authorization, I told my lawyer. Make it simple enough for Paige to ignore the risks, but broad enough to get us every log they have. Naomi transmitted the signed authorization to Hartwell Fulfillment, Northline Industrial, the software vendor, and the insurance carrier early Tuesday morning. I sat at the small wooden desk in my condo, typing up a compliance report for my newest client, and the steady rhythm of the keyboard felt incredibly grounding. The first invoice of the month cleared my bank account before noon. I immediately routed the funds to cover my upcoming physical therapy sessions, proving to myself that the legal settlement was not my only lifeline. A confirmation email arrived from Northline shortly after lunch, stating that because Paige had signed her name on that heavy legal stock, the maintenance company agreed to release the original service logs. The printed ticket arrived via courier the following afternoon. The bold text across the top read, "Remove from service immediately." Naomi set the document on my kitchen counter right next to the version from the official insurance file, which quietly suggested we continue with monitoring. We did not celebrate the discovery. I picked up a red pen and drew a firm circle around the altered text, feeling the undeniable proof under my hand. Meanwhile, the software vendor notified us they were currently exporting the master audit logs, and a retail investor formally asked my sister why a safety dispute had been omitted from the corporate disclosures. The investors did not permanently cancel their deal, but they officially paused the closing process by Thursday morning. At the exact same time, the insurance carrier triggered a special investigation protocol. My phone buzzed constantly, lighting up with the name of the VeloMotion founder every 10 minutes, so I silenced the device and required all communication in writing. A voicemail slipped through from my mother. Judith sounded frantic, warning me that innocent warehouse workers would lose their jobs because of my stubbornness, effortlessly twisting my desire for the truth into a betrayal of the staff. I forwarded the audio file directly to my attorney and went to my physical therapy appointment. The doorbell chimed relentlessly just past 8 o'clock that evening. My intercom screen showed Paige standing in the hallway, clutching a thick manila folder against her chest. Her expensive silk blouse looked wrinkled, and dark mascara smudged beneath her eyes, completely shattering her polished executive image. I opened the door just enough to keep the heavy brass chain engaged. "Lauren, you have to undo this," Paige pleaded, pushing her face near the narrow crack in the doorway. "The entire review is just a massive technical misunderstanding, and it is completely spooking the investors. If the records are clean, there is no reason to stop the review," I said. My right leg throbbed, forcing me to lean heavily onto my aluminum cane. "If this retail deal dies, everyone at the fulfillment center will know you caused it," my sister fired back. Her voice rose in pitch, echoing down the empty hall. She fumbled with her phone, tapped the screen, and held the device up toward the gap in the door. My mother spoke through the tiny speaker. "Your father wanted you two to take care of each other, Lauren. Please do not do this to your sister. Taking care of family did not mean lying to federal regulators and corporate investors." I shook my head, refusing to engage with the manufactured guilt. "I will sign a promissory note," Paige offered quickly. She dropped the phone back into her leather purse. "I will pay you double the interest on the settlement money if you just call Naomi right now and cancel the audit." "No." The desperate, tearful expression vanished from the CEO's face. "You are enjoying this," she spat, her words sharp and vicious. "You love holding this over my head because you finally have some power." My phone vibrated in my pocket. Naomi was calling. I accepted the connection and put the device to my ear, keeping my eyes locked on the angry woman standing in the hallway. "The system vendor just flagged a critical security event," my attorney said, her tone crisp and urgent. "An administrative account attempted to permanently delete the entire safety directory on the company server 20 minutes ago. The legal hold had successfully intercepted the command, keeping the copied files perfectly intact. More importantly, the Internet Protocol address for the deletion request matched a router located inside my sister's house." I lowered the phone and looked through the brass chain. "What did you delete, Paige?" The crying stopped instantly. My sister straightened her shoulders, her jaw set tight, and her features hardened into a mask of pure, cold calculation. The recovered safety folder held exactly what my sister had desperately tried to destroy. Naomi sat across my kitchen island the next morning, methodically sorting through the digital files the legal hold had successfully intercepted. Among the standard maintenance logs and weekly employee rosters was a rough draft of the temporary loading procedure. 2 letters were stamped at the bottom of the page in bold black ink. They were the initials of Marcus Reed. An email from the chief executive officer hit my attorney's inbox 10 minutes later. Paige officially claimed Marcus had independently operated the damaged machinery and insisted I was targeting the wrong person to secure a larger payout. My mother immediately followed up with a phone call to Naomi, quietly reminding the lawyer that the shift supervisor had a documented history of disciplinary issues. A sudden memory surfaced in my mind. I pictured Marcus standing in the warehouse right before the steel collapsed, looking terrified and remaining completely silent while Paige barked orders over the radio. Blaming the supervisor felt incredibly convenient for a company trying to save a retail merger. Naomi arranged a formal meeting. Marcus sat across a heavy mahogany conference table in a neutral law office, flanked by his own legal counsel. The warehouse veteran looked completely exhausted. Deep shadows circled his eyes, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a glass of water from the glass pitcher. He admitted to signing one specific page of the procedure, but he swore it was merely an acknowledgement of instruction, not a safety approval. "Who gave the direct order?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely level. "Who else was standing there? And why did you not report the mechanical bypass to the facility manager?" Marcus stared down at his shaking hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He admitted he was terrified of losing his pension and his healthcare benefits. He simply lacked the courage to halt the automated line against direct executive orders. "Your fear does not erase the permanent nerve damage in my leg," I told him, adjusting my aluminum cane against the armrest. "But your silence does not automatically make you a liar, either." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and placed an older model smartphone on the polished wood. He had taken clear screenshots of his text messages and forwarded them to a private email address hours before the corporate office officially fired him. Naomi connected the device to her laptop to verify the digital chain of custody. The text messages illuminated the screen, reading clear as day. "Bypass the stop for this shipment." The sender was Paige. A second message arrived hours after the accident. "Lauren approved the temporary procedure, so stick to that timeline." My lawyer saved the verified transcripts to our secure drive. We officially moved the fact that Paige knew about the mechanical danger out of the suspect column and permanently into the proven column. However, a text message did not explain how my flawless signature ended up on a fraudulent insurance document. The answer to that specific question was already sitting inside my locked filing cabinet. An independent forensic document examiner evaluated the forged procedure form the following morning. The expert compared the digital ink to a specific vendor contract I had signed and processed 6 months prior. Every single pixel, every stroke width, and every microscopic hesitation in the pen pressure matched flawlessly. The forgery was simply a cropped image taken directly from my own legitimate contract. I remembered Paige asking me to email her a scanned copy of that exact paperwork for the corporate vendor archive just weeks before the racks fell. The audit export provided the next crucial piece of the timeline. The fraudulent acknowledgement file was originally created on a laptop officially assigned to the company founder. The operating system logged the creation time as 2 days after the heavy steel crushed my pelvis. Furthermore, the working draft was saved under the title Lauren Final. Naomi tapped her expensive pen against her legal pad, warning me that Paige could easily claim a rogue administrative employee had borrowed her computer. We still needed something that conclusively tied the executive team to the intentional cover-up. Meanwhile, my sister launched a highly aggressive public counterattack. She sent a company-wide internal memo accusing me of leveraging an unfortunate settlement dispute to execute a hostile takeover of the athletic brand. Several junior employees replied to the thread with panicked questions about their upcoming paychecks. I refused to sink to her level by leaking the verified text messages online. Instead, I instructed Restructuring Counsel to issue a strict legal mandate protecting employee payroll and explicitly forbidding any retaliation against cooperating witnesses. Later that afternoon, Naomi ran a deeper diagnostic on the recovered draft properties. She expanded the document revision history and found a hidden comment attached directly to the forged signature block. The text was short and clinically precise. "Use the vendor's signature because she will not remember." The author tag attached to that specific comment did not belong to my sister. The internal system recorded the creator under a completely different set of initials. The letters were J and M. I stared at the screen, feeling the temperature in my condominium suddenly plummet. Paige was reckless, arrogant, and desperate for retail funding. But the woman who calmly suggested slicing my signature from an old contract to exploit my brain trauma was supposed to be the person who kept our family together. Judith Mercer had finally left a digital fingerprint. A thick cream envelope arrived by certified mail the following morning. The heavy paper carried the embossed seal of a prominent corporate law firm. Paige had officially retained aggressive outside counsel, and their opening move was a formal accusation of extortion. The letter claimed I was leveraging a tragic workplace accident to steal proprietary data, threatening the brand to extract a larger, unjustified settlement. My phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. Text messages from confused aunts and distant cousins flooded the screen. Judith was actively calling the extended family, whispering terrible things in her soft, maternal voice. My mother told our relatives that my brain had not fully recovered from the physical trauma, painting me as unstable, bitter, and completely out of touch with reality. Heat flushed my cheeks. My fingers reached for the keyboard to type a furious, evidence-filled response, but Naomi placed a firm hand over my wrist. "We answer with data," the lawyer said, her tone cool and steady, never with emotion. The system vendor delivered the final access logs just before noon. The dense spreadsheet proved exactly what my attorney needed. 0 login attempts existed under my specific credentials following the date my administrative rights were revoked. Every single document in our possession originated strictly from the signed authorization, the legal preservation response, or my own independent files. I recalled that quiet night sitting at my kitchen island, staring at the familiar login prompt, and deliberately closing the laptop lid. That single moment of discipline had completely destroyed Paige's manufactured counterclaim. Naomi reviewed the clean security audit and smiled. "Your restraint just saved the entire case." A deeper analysis of the internal system produced a much darker truth. The corporate controller account had manually changed the original safety ticket from critically unsafe to monitor status. A 2-factor authentication code was texted directly to Judith's personal cell phone to authorize that exact database change. Security camera footage from the corporate office lobby confirmed the administrative staff had clocked out and left the building hours before the login occurred. Furthermore, the master audit trail showed my mother's assigned laptop uploading the forged procedure directly into the official insurance directory. The beloved family matriarch could not blame a junior assistant without contradicting the permanent digital evidence. My mother demanded a private meeting that afternoon. She insisted on a quiet coffee shop downtown, expressly forbidding legal representation. I agreed to the neutral location, but brought Naomi anyway. Judith sat in a corner booth, wearing a soft cashmere sweater, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The smell of dark roasted espresso and burnt milk hung heavy in the air. "I do not understand all this technical metadata," the older woman sniffled, refusing to look at my attorney. Paige was panicking about the retail buyers. I simply followed her instructions to keep the investors calm. I set my aluminum cane against the vinyl booth and leaned forward. "Then why did your account leave a hidden comment telling Paige to use my old vendor signature?" The damp tissue paused. Judith lowered her hands, folding them neatly on the tabletop. The fragile, tearful expression evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating stare that chilled me to the bone. "Your sister employs dozens of innocent people, Lauren. They have mortgages and families to feed," she said smoothly. "You are just one person, living comfortably alone in a secured building." A hollow ache settled deep behind my ribs. The woman who raised me had literally weighed my survival against a corporate payroll and decided my broken body was an acceptable business expense. "I did what any mother would do to protect her family," Judith stated. "You were my mother too," I replied. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. Judith leaned across the small table, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "If you push this into a courtroom, I will testify under oath that you explicitly approved that loading procedure from your hospital bed. Who do you think a judge will believe? A licensed financial officer, or a bitter woman, hopped up on heavy painkillers?" She truly believed her professional credential was a bulletproof shield. I did not argue, nor did I try to convince her of the truth. I simply looked at Naomi and nodded. We stood up from the booth. While walking slowly toward the exit, I pulled out my smartphone and opened my digital healthcare portal. With 3 deliberate taps, I permanently deleted Judith Mercer from my emergency contact list and completely revoked her medical authorization. Severing that final thread of control felt like taking my first real breath in 38 years. The consequences rippled outward by Friday morning. The commercial insurance carrier identified multiple signs of falsified records. They officially referred the entire liability claim to their internal fraud investigation unit. The corporate board of directors convened an emergency session, immediately suspending Paige from her executive duties and stripping Judith of all financial access. No one was wearing handcuffs yet, but the pristine, manufactured facade of VeloMotion was crumbling fast. Naomi warned me that the fraud investigation meant insurers, state investigators, and prosecutors could soon scrutinize every communication connected to the claim. We were entering a highly dangerous new phase. Right before sunset, a high-priority alert flashed across Naomi's tablet. The vendor security team flagged a secondary event. Someone had just attempted to permanently erase the forged draft folder for a second time. The Internet Protocol address traced straight back to my sister's private residence. The suspended executive had just created powerful evidence that she knew the files were dangerous and wanted them gone. Owen Park appeared at the deposition center with a thick manila folder containing the smoking gun we had been searching for. He walked into the sterile conference room, his shoulders tight, and laid a set of photographs on the table. The clear images showed the stripped interlock mechanism on Bay 4, followed by the original maintenance ticket he had generated weeks before the collapse. He also produced a printed log of his phone calls and a chain of emails sent directly to the executive office. Owen testified under oath that he had walked Paige directly to the loading dock and pointed at the failing steel supports. He had explicitly told her that the rack was a death trap and needed to be pulled from service immediately. Paige had stood right there on the concrete, looked at the dangerous mechanism, and asked if the equipment could possibly run for just a few more days to satisfy the spring launch. Judith had been copied on the follow-up email, which confirmed she knew exactly what her daughter was doing when she helped reclassify the safety status. The chain of knowledge was finally complete, and there was no way to argue that this had been a simple administrative oversight. The corporate board of directors contacted me 3 days later. They were panicked, lacking both liquid capital and public credibility. Yet the brand still possessed genuine inventory, loyal customers, and active shipping contracts. The restructuring manager offered me an interim lead position, promising that only I truly understood how to rebuild the fragmented fulfillment system. The temptation to accept was incredibly shocking. It felt like a chance to finally prove my worth to the very people who had once treated me as an expendable asset. I looked at the contract they handed over, scanning for clauses that would require me to rehabilitate my sister's reputation or protect the family's majority ownership. When the restructuring manager gave me a vague, non-committal answer about protecting the founders, I set the pen down. I refused to let them turn me into the cleanup crew for their latest catastrophe. I offered a different path to protect the innocent employees caught in the crossfire. My attorney drafted a strict operational roadmap based on the private records I owned, but I tied my cooperation to ironclad conditions. The company had to guarantee full payment of all outstanding payroll, promise zero retaliation against Marcus or the warehouse crew, and commit to hiring an independent safety auditor. I did not provide these documents as a favor to my family. I signed a professional consulting agreement that strictly limited my hours and clearly defined my scope of work for a fair hourly fee. For the first time in my life, I felt like a professional entity, not a family martyr. Paige made one final attempt to silence the brewing storm. Her lawyer sent over a formal offer to resolve all disputes. She would provide a cash payment, disguised as a family loan repayment, provided I signed a document officially blaming Hartwell Fulfillment for the entire accident. The offer was legal in form, but it was ethically bankrupt. It was a purchase agreement for my silence, designed to strip away my right to cooperate with the ongoing fraud investigation. I did not even pick up the pen. I passed the paperwork directly to Naomi, adding it to the growing pile of evidence regarding my sister's attempt to influence a potential witness. The two women who had spent my entire life presenting a united front began to devour each other within a week. The investigators conducted separate interviews to ensure no collusion occurred. Paige claimed that Judith handled all the insurance filings and had acted on her own initiative. My mother retorted that she had only processed the paperwork Paige explicitly commanded her to submit, including the directive to use my forged signature. Both women frantically scrambled to minimize their own roles, yet every single attempt to deflect only highlighted their shared guilt. Paige insisted she had no idea the Bay 4 equipment was unsafe, but Owen's photographic evidence completely shattered that narrative. Judith claimed she never saw the forged signature file, but the internal system logs showed she had been the one to write the specific comment instructing Paige to use my vendor data. Their alliance was dissolving into a pile of mutual resentment and half-truths. I sat in a private room during one of Naomi's briefings, watching the legal fallout unfold through the notes on her screen. It was not a joyful experience. Watching the structure of my family collapse felt like witnessing the demolition of the fulfillment racks all over again. I realized that the unity I had spent decades trying to maintain had never actually existed. It was a fragile piece that only survived as long as I was the one bearing the weight of every mistake. Late that night, I listened to a recording of a police interview Naomi had obtained through Discovery. Paige's voice was strained, vibrating with a mix of fury and fear as she spoke to the lead investigator. She accused Judith of incompetence, saying that her mother had been the one to manage the document templates from the very beginning. In an adjacent room, the investigators played that recording for my mother. Judith sat in silence for a long time before she finally spoke. She looked directly into the camera lens, her face tight and expressionless, and stated that Paige had convinced her I would never actually fight back because I had always been the quiet, obedient sister. I stopped the audio recording right there. The two women who had spent years telling me that blood was thicker than water were now using that very blood to ensure the other went to prison. The revenge I had sought was not coming from my hands. It was coming from the weight of their own choices. The investigators had enough to proceed with formal charges against both of them. My sister and mother were officially standing on the edge of a precipice, and for once I was not standing behind them, ready to catch them before they hit the ground. The retail investors pulled their capital entirely, citing the insurmountable risks uncovered during the forensic records review. Without the promised infusion of cash, the brand lacked the runway to survive the fiscal quarter. A partner firm within the industry eventually stepped forward, purchasing the remaining physical assets, proprietary apparel formulas, and valid customer contracts for a fraction of the original valuation. The acquisition deal contained non-negotiable conditions. The founder had to be removed from all leadership roles. The CFO was barred from exercising any financial authority, and a permanent, independent safety oversight board had to be established. VeloMotion vanished as a corporate entity. The new owners stripped the logo from the walls of the warehouse and scrubbed every trace of the founder's name from the marketing materials. Paige stood on the sidewalk as the maintenance crew pried the signature sign off the front of the fulfillment building. The metal screeched against the brick, a jagged, dying sound that signaled the end of her executive career. She watched with a glassy, hollow stare, looking suddenly much older than 33. I did not stop to talk to her. I drove past the loading docks, focusing on the road ahead. The board of directors officially terminated my sister's employment for cause. They cited clear, documented findings of intentional nondisclosure, fraudulent record manipulation, and willful evidence tampering. Paige tried to make one last, desperate claim that I had staged the entire crisis as a sophisticated revenge plot to hijack the company. The board did not even bother to invite me to the hearing. They simply pointed toward the external audit reports and the verified maintenance logs. My sister was escorted out of the building by private security, and the company refused to cover her legal defense costs for actions taken outside her professional scope. Judith suffered a different, slower erosion of her status. I filed a formal complaint with the state board regarding her professional accountancy practices, providing proof of how she had weaponized her license to validate the forged insurance documents. My mother begged me to send a retraction letter, claiming it was all a tragic misunderstanding. She reminded me that our family home would be sold to cover the restitution payments and the massive business debt obligations. "You are forcing me into poverty, Lauren," Judith said, her voice thin and desperate over the phone. "I gave everything for this family. Do you really want your own mother to end up in a state-funded facility?" "You chose to use your professional license to authorize a lie," I replied, my voice steady. "You did not use that license to protect your family. You used it to hide a crime. I did not write the letter." She lost her certification, and the subsequent financial liquidation of her assets moved forward as planned. The house was sold, the debts were settled, and the woman who had spent my entire childhood curating the perfect family image had to deal with the public reality of her own choices. The civil insurance claim eventually reached a settlement phase. The carrier offered a significant supplemental payment to compensate for my permanent injuries, but the initial agreement included a broad confidentiality clause and a statement of no admission from the company. Naomi and I pushed back hard. "I did not want the money. if it meant I was legally bound to call the investigation a mistake. We negotiated a revised version that explicitly confirmed I had never approved the loading procedures, covered my legal expenses, and provided a fund to support the affected warehouse workers. I accepted these terms. I did not ask for the company, and I did not ask for a public apology that would only be offered to save their own skins. While the criminal case moved forward, I kept working. My consulting income covered my ordinary expenses, and the settlement remained protected for medical care and the future the accident had altered. Building that quiet independence mattered more than anything VeloMotion had once promised me. Naomi called me late one Tuesday evening with the final status of the criminal proceedings. The public prosecutor had structured a plea agreement that would hold the perpetrators accountable for their specific actions. My sister faced a negotiated custodial sentence, followed by supervised probation, full restitution, and a court-ordered restriction on holding corporate financial authority during the supervision period. Judith was offered a shorter period of confinement, followed by extensive home monitoring and the loss of her professional status. Both women refused the terms unless I personally penned a letter to the judge asking for maximum leniency. When I refused, their lawyers warned them that taking the case to trial would expose every message, altered file, and deletion attempt to a jury. Within 48 hours, both women accepted the agreements. Neither received the letter they had expected me to write. Paige sent one final handwritten note to my office. The script was messy and rushed. She asked if losing her company and her reputation was not enough, claiming the prison time was an act of personal cruelty on my part. I read the note, then handed it to Naomi. "Tell them no," I said. My sister and mother would have to face the court on their own. They would have to explain their choices to a judge, without me there to act as the buffer between their actions and the consequences. When I refused to write the letter, both women accepted the plea agreements without my help. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. For the first time in my life, I would enter a room where my mother and sister had to face the consequences without me standing between them and the fall. The courtroom air smelled of floor wax and stale nerves. I walked through the double doors, my aluminum cane rhythmically striking the polished linoleum. Naomi trailed half a step behind me, her presence. A silent assurance that I was not navigating this alone. The wooden benches were packed with people I barely recognized, yet I felt every pair of eyes tracking my labored gait. Paige sat at the defense table, wearing a beige suit that looked expensive but lacked any real structure. She did not look like an executive anymore. She looked like a woman waiting for a miracle she had not earned. Judith occupied the seat next to her, staring fixedly at her own hands. When my mother finally looked up, she made a small, pathetic gesture of supplication, tilting her head in that familiar, practiced way that used to make me feel responsible for her peace of mind. I did not offer a nod. I did not blink. I sat on the hard bench, my back straight, and waited for the court to begin. The prosecutor stood and walked to the podium. He did not need to shout. He simply read through the undisputed facts of the case, a sequence of events that felt colder and more devastating when spoken aloud by someone else. He narrated the warning email I had sent, the direct orders Paige had issued to ignore those warnings, the deliberate modification of the maintenance tickets, the theft of my signature from a vendor contract, and the final, frantic attempt to delete the evidence from the server. Each sentence was a building block of truth that removed any possibility of a family misunderstanding. My sister had made a series of conscious decisions, and my mother had verified every step of that path. Paige stood when invited to speak. Her voice wavered, sounding thin and brittle against the high ceilings of the hall. She claimed she had been under immense pressure to secure the retail funding for the brand and never intended for anyone to actually get hurt. She described the accident as a tragedy of circumstance, carefully choosing words that suggested she was a victim of a system that demanded too much from a young founder. She turned toward me, her eyes wet, and said she had always believed I understood her dream better than anyone else. The judge listened without a flicker of expression. He looked down at the documents on his desk and asked why, if she had been so concerned about safety, she had spent the 2 days following the collapse creating a fraudulent insurance document that blamed the injured party. Paige opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer that did not make her look like a predator. Judith chose to speak next. she stood with a practiced, dignified grace, her voice steady and soft. She told the court that she had dedicated her entire adult life to nurturing her daughters and protecting the family's stability. She requested leniency, asking to remain free so she could provide the emotional support Paige would surely need during her transition into the legal system. The prosecutor interrupted, referencing the internal file metadata Naomi had successfully recovered. He pointed out that Judith had personally authored the comment telling Paige to use the vendor's signature because I would not remember. The judge looked at my mother and asked if she had any explanation for that specific instruction. Judith glanced at me, her expression a fragile mask of expectancy. She was waiting for me to stand up. She was waiting for me to do what I had always done, to save her from the consequences of her own malice by offering some kind of forgiving interjection. I remained perfectly still. I did not stand. I did not speak. I watched my mother realize, for the first time, that the buffer she had used to protect herself for 3 decades was gone. Then came the time for the victim impact statement. I rose, leaning heavily on the cane, and walked to the front of the room. The transition from the bench to the podium felt miles long. I did not look at the defense table. I spoke to the judge. I talked about the physical reality of living in a body that had been treated as a line item on a balance sheet. I explained that this was not a dispute over a failed business deal or a temporary sibling rivalry. It was about the cold, deliberate calculation that required my pain to preserve their reputation. They did not lose everything because I exposed them, I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. They lost it the moment they decided my life was cheaper than delaying a product launch. They made their choice, and now they must own the reality of it. The sentencing phase followed, a necessary administrative finality. Paige was sentenced to 18 months of incarceration, to be served in the state system, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, full restitution, and a permanent restriction from serving as an officer or director of any corporate entity. Judith received 6 months of confinement, followed by home monitoring, supervised probation, and financial restitution. The State Accountancy Board later permanently revoked her professional license based on the admitted falsification of financial and insurance records. As the bailiffs approached, the facade shattered completely. Paige spun in her chair, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred as she glared at Judith. She hissed that if my mother had not been so eager to play CFO, the forgery might never have been discovered. Judith gasped, her hand flying to her throat, and retorted that it was Paige who had specifically told her I would never have the spine to fight back. They devolved into a shrill, frantic argument right there at the defense table, the sound of their mutual betrayal rising above the murmurs of the courtroom. I did not wait for the door to lock behind them. I turned around and walked out into the cool afternoon air. Naomi stepped outside with me, looking at her watch. "The paperwork for the restitution fund will be finalized tomorrow," she said, her voice gentle. "Where would you like to go now?" I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs without the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. I looked at the city skyline and felt a profound sense of space. "To work," I replied. "I have a client waiting." Months drifted by, marked by the slow, grinding reality of legal restitution and the finalization of corporate dissolution. Paige began serving her custodial sentence in a state facility. After completing 6 months in custody, Judith transitioned to court-ordered home monitoring, stripped of the professional status she had spent 40 years building. Letters arrived at my office from time to time, thick envelopes containing rambling, handwritten pages that still sought to rewrite the past. Each note blamed the other. Yet neither woman ever accepted the fundamental truth of their choices. Paige begged for a single designer coat from the liquidated estate, while Judith insisted that our family should not have ended in such a public, devastating fashion. I read the first few lines of every page, but the paper soon found its way into the recycling bin, unread and unanswered. The company assets had been successfully acquired, and the new owners finally installed the independent safety oversight board I had demanded. Marcus Reed eventually found work at a regional distribution center 2 states away. We were never friends, and I did not reach out to track his progress. His life was simply a separate path, one that did not involve me anymore. I heard through the industry grapevine that he had successfully participated in a mandatory safety retraining program, but his story was no longer woven into mine. Several warehouse workers sent anonymous notes of gratitude to my office, acknowledging that the payroll protection had saved their homes during the chaotic weeks of restructuring. It felt strange to be a savior to people I hardly knew, yet it confirmed that I had done the right thing by protecting them without needing to become the sacrificial pillar of the company again. The final settlement disbursement finally cleared the legal hold accounts. I methodically paid off the medical liens that had followed me since the accident and settled the legal invoices Naomi had generated over the long months of discovery. I allocated a specific fund for ongoing physical therapy and dedicated a portion of the remainder to the structural modifications required for my condo. The actual amount left in my bank account was far smaller than the extravagant figures my mother had imagined, but it was enough to provide a secure, quiet life. I did not purchase a luxury vehicle or invest in a lifestyle I did not need. I bought peace of mind, silence, and the ability to say no to anyone who threatened my autonomy. My consulting firm, Mercer Compliance Studio, officially expanded. I hired an assistant who handled my scheduling, allowing me to focus on the high-level operations reviews that were my true strength. I signed a long-term contract with a medical device manufacturer, and the work was incredibly satisfying. One afternoon, a new client asked why I was so rigid about the safety documentation protocols, suggesting I might be making the process more difficult than it needed to be. I looked at the man across the desk and remembered the exact weight of a falling steel rack. "Process is not just paperwork," I told him, my voice steady and firm. "It is the only thing that ensures a warning is actually heard before someone else pays the price." He did not ask me again. Naomi stopped by the office to deliver the final court orders, closing the loop on the litigation that had dominated our lives for over a year. She looked at me, noting the way I stood without the cane for short stretches, though I still kept it close by for the days when the nerve pain made the floor feel like it was shifting under my feet. We did not celebrate with champagne or toasts. We shared a quiet, professional lunch and talked about the future. My mother eventually requested a final visitation, but I set strict boundaries through Naomi. I agreed to accept letters under very specific conditions. No mention of money, no denial of the established facts, and no requests for me to act as a messenger between her and my sister. I would not promise to forgive them once they regained their freedom. Forgiveness was a heavy, complicated thing that I did not yet possess, and I refused to pretend it was a simple commodity I could trade for their comfort. Boundaries were not a punishment. They were the environment where I finally learned how to live. On my final afternoon of work, I sat at my desk and looked out the window. The city bustled below, a chaotic, messy, beautiful sprawl of people living lives I no longer had to manage. The nerve pain in my leg was a dull, constant reminder of what had happened, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my existence. I looked at the 3 items I kept on the shelf: the forged signature, the confirmed lie, and the first contract of my new life. I walked to the shelf, took the 2 documents from the past, and placed them into the bottom of a heavy box. They had served their function. They were the evidence of a war that was finally over. I did not need to see them every morning to remember who I was, or more importantly, who I had stopped being. I left the 3rd document, the one representing my own work and my own choices, right where it belonged. I walked to the window, watching the sun begin to dip behind the buildings. There was a sense of profound relief in knowing that the people who had built their success on my silence were finally staring at the consequences of their own actions. I had lost years to their greed, but I had gained something they would never understand. I had gained the capacity to walk away. I finished my report, closed the lid of my laptop, and stood up from the chair I had earned with my own labor. I walked toward the door, not because I was running from them, but because I had somewhere else to be. I had finally stopped handing my life over to anyone else. You have spent your entire life believing that being the responsible one means bearing the weight of every mistake your family makes, but survival has taught you a harder, more necessary lesson. True loyalty to those you love does not require you to sacrifice your physical health, your professional integrity, or your future for the sake of maintaining a facade. When you consistently rescue people from the consequences of their own choices, you are not protecting them. You are simply enabling them to continue the cycle of exploitation until there is nothing left of you to consume. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, nor is it a betrayal of your history. It is the only way to honor the person you are actually becoming, rather than the role you were forced to play. You deserve a life built on your own labor, defined by your own values, and sustained by the boundaries you have the absolute right to enforce. Have you ever wondered how many parts of yourself you have quietly handed over to someone else just to keep the peace, and what your life might look like if you finally decided to keep them for yourself?